It started with a notification I almost ignored, a small chime on my phone at 9:14 p.m. When the house was quiet and the dishwasher was humming like a tired machine trying to stay alive. I had already brushed my daughter's hair, folded tomorrow's clothes, and told myself I'd read one chapter before bed. Then the screen lit up. New recurring meeting, $7 a.m. Daily, the subject line said efficiency huddle. I stared at it for a full minute, as if it might explain itself. The invite came from Thomas, our new director. I had met him twice. Once when he toured the floor with a clipboard. Once when he called me Jennifer, even though my name is Laura. He had that kind of presence you could smell before he spoke. Confidence, aftershave, and coffee strong enough to burn through glass. I thought maybe it was a mistake. My name is Laura. I'm 42, a senior marketing manager. I've been here 11 years, long enough to know that culture always hides in the calendar. I've survived 4 rebrands, 3 directors, and 1 corporate merger. But that night, staring at that 7 a.m. invite, I realized this would be the first time I'd have to fight for something I couldn't clock in or out of, my own hours. But when the second invite appeared the next day, same time, same title, I realized it wasn't. Thomas believed early meant serious. He said it in meetings, interviews, even hallway jokes. Winners start early, he liked to say, smiling in a way that made it sound like a rule instead of advice. So there it was, a rule disguised as culture, typed neatly into my calendar. My manager said early meetings showed commitment. I said, commitment doesn't need coffee at 6:30. He laughed, but not kindly. I closed my laptop and looked at the paper calendar on my wall. I still keep one, a habit from before everything turned digital. I drew a small red circle around the next morning, 7 a.m., and went to bed. At 6:52, I was already on the highway, one hand on the wheel, the other balancing a travel mug that burned my fingers. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the office lights glared like they'd been waiting all night. When I entered the meeting room, Thomas was already there, typing furiously, his tie perfectly centered. He looked up at me and said, "Glad you made it." We were just getting started. There were only 3 other people there, all men, all childless from what I knew. He started talking about productivity metrics, time optimization, alignment of energy cycles. The phrases sounded imported from a podcast. At exactly 7:28, he wrapped up saying, "See you tomorrow." Same time, I smiled. Because of course, by the end of the first week, my mornings were gone. By the end of the first month, I had counted 14 meetings before 8 a.m., 14 red circles on my paper calendar. Like small wounds, still my numbers were perfect. My quarterly report showed my projects leading in engagement and ROI. Yet, in my performance feedback, Thomas wrote, "Shows morning energy." That phrase made me laugh, but not the happy kind. I was 42, not ancient, but old enough to know tone when I heard it. Morning energy meant motherhood fatigue. It meant not one of us. One afternoon, as I poured coffee into a chipped mug, a yo, she meant well, maybe. But I felt it like a slap. Align your family priorities. Polite bias wrapped in self-help. That night, when the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop and scrolled through the invites again, each one, 7 a.m. each one, organized by Thomas. I didn't reply. I just started keeping track. I opened a small notebook and wrote each date down, after 2 wee red dot for every early meeting. By the end of the month, the page looked like a rash spreading across the paper. The next Tuesday, the pattern continued at 9:12 p.m., another invite. I was brushing my teeth when the phone lit up again. My husband looked at me and said, "You're not actually going, are you?" "I have to," I said. "They'll notice." He didn't say anything. He just turned off the light. And I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling like time itself had been stolen from me in half-hour blocks. The next morning, I walked into the office half awake, the world outside still gray, the fluorescent lights too sharp. Thomas was there, bright and alert. He held a green smoothie. "Winners start early," he said again. I smiled the way women do when they've learned that arguing costs more energy than silence. But silence, I've learned, can be its own kind of weapon. When they weaponize time, make it countable. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or drama. It came with a thermometer. My daughter woke up that morning pale and shivering, her skin hot to the touch. The little digital screen blinked. 102 degrees. I sent a quick email before midnight, half asleep, explaining I'd join the 7 a.m. meeting online and take her to the pediatrician after. I thought it was reasonable. Reasonable, that word people use when they still believe the system is fair. At 6:02 a.m., my phone pinged. Thomas had replied. "Need energy in the room. Attendance mandatory." I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Energy in the room. It wasn't about energy. It was about visibility, about control, about the performance of devotion I left anyway. I kissed my daughter's forehead, whispered that I'd be back soon, and drove through the fog with the heater blasting. I was 10 minutes late. When I opened the door, everyone looked up like I'd interrupted a ceremony. Thomas didn't pause his sentence. He just said, "Glad you could join us." By noon, there was a formal notice in my inbox. Performance warning, attendance issues. Attendance. As if I were a student being graded on punctuality instead of output. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't even talk about it. I just opened my laptop and printed out every calendar invite from the last 3 months. I laid them across my kitchen table, like cards in a crime scene. Every one of them scheduled before 8. Every one of them created by Thomas. I highlighted the organizer field in yellow, the time in red. The page looked like an infection. I taped the pages to my office wall, one by one, until the wallpaper disappeared behind evidence. Then I took my old paper calendar from the drawer, the one I used years ago when I still believed in balance, and hung it beside them. Each time a new 7 a.m. meeting appeared, I marked it with a red X. The pattern was perfect, predictable, almost mathematical. Bias is often that way, consistent, measurable, invisible, until someone decides to look. 2 weeks later, the wall looked like a wound. I stopped venting to coworkers. There's a fine line between team player and troublemaker, and women learn to sense it early. Instead, I started reading policies, guidelines, every document HR ever published. Somewhere between the corporate jargon, I found a sentence. Employees are entitled to reasonable scheduling accommodation when work-life balance is materially affected. It was buried on page 47, under inclusive practices. No one had ever defined what reasonable meant. So I started collecting data quietly, internal surveys, department reports, attrition studies. I wasn't supposed to have access to some of them, but information has a way of leaking when you ask the right questions with the right smile. By the end of the week, I had numbers. 22% of female employees had requested schedule adjustments in the past year. 60% of parents who left the company had done so within 2 years of returning from parental leave. Teams that allowed flexible hours retained 30% more staff. 3 numbers. That's all it takes to turn opinion into evidence. I spent Saturday night at my dining table drafting a memo titled Proposed Policy, Reasonable Scheduling Act, Internal Pilot. It wasn't angry. It wasn't personal. Just 1.5 pages long, neutral tone, bullet points, metrics, and 1 quiet sentence at the end. Efficiency is only sustainable when time is equitable. On Monday, during lunch, I printed it on company letterhead and slipped it into Alicia's hand. She was our HR partner, someone who noticed things but never said them out loud. She read it once, folded it twice, and said, "You know, corporate's DEI audit starts next month." I smiled. "Then maybe," I said, "they'll want to start it at 8. After that, I waited. Not anxiously, just patiently. The kind of patience that feels like power. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood in front of the team, holding a printed announcement. Corporate DEI will be conducting a scheduling equity review next week, he said, with the stiff smile of a man trying to sound proactive about his own undoing. Half the room went quiet. The other half, the women, smiled. 3 days later, a new notification appeared in my inbox. Efficiency huddle rescheduled to 8 a.m. for accessibility. The subject line didn't mention who suggested it. It didn't have to. Thomas frowned in the next meeting, clicking his pen like it owed him something. "Who requested this audit?" he asked the room. I looked up from my notes and said calmly, "Maybe the calendar did." That silence was better than applause. It was the sound of power shifting, even if no one would name it. The next few weeks felt lighter. Mornings had color again. My kids noticed. "You're home when we wake up," my son said one day, half surprised. I smiled. "Looks like Mom's office finally joined the 21st century." The audit came and went quietly. Corporate sent a formal report. Documented bias found in meeting scheduling practices between 7 to 8 a.m. HR issued a new directive within a month. Core working hours, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. They called it the Core Hour Initiative. It sounded bureaucratic, but to me, it was poetry. Employee satisfaction went up 27% the following quarter. HR posted about embracing work-life harmony. They credited anonymous employee analysis. They didn't need to say my name. Silence has its own kind of recognition. Still, Thomas's tone changed. "Not much, just enough to notice." He stopped calling meetings before 9. Stopped replying to emails after 6. Once, I caught him walking out at 4:15, pretending to check his watch like it was a new discipline. He never said thank you. I didn't expect him to. After the audit, things didn't change overnight, not visibly at least. But culture has a way of shifting one sigh at a time. I could feel it in the hallway greetings, in the slower pace of morning footsteps, in the small but growing silence where tension used to live. People started coming in with actual smiles, not the caffeine kind. The core hour policy rolled out company-wide 2 weeks later. The announcement email was classic corporate. Blue banner, serif font, a quote from some executive about workplace inclusivity and productivity alignment. The phrase "balance is productivity" appeared 3 times. It made me laugh quietly. Corporate poetry, unintentional but honest. For the first time in years, my alarm clock rang at 6:30 instead of 5:30. I sat with my kids for breakfast. Toast and jam and laughter sticky on their fingers. My daughter told me she liked mornings again. That was when I realized just how much had been stolen by those invisible hours. I didn't need public credit. I didn't want it. The best kind of justice doesn't demand recognition. It just rearranges the world until wrong feels unnatural again. Still, Thomas noticed. His silence told me that. He wasn't unkind, just colder. He stopped making eye contact during meetings, started copying unnecessary managers on emails. The kind of passive resistance that men use when they've been forced to share air with fairness. One Thursday afternoon, I found a note on my desk, a printed agenda for a leadership development session. The topic, inclusive scheduling practices. Attendance, mandatory. I almost laughed out loud. The day of the session, the conference room was brighter than usual, as if HR had ordered extra sunlight. There were about 20 of us. Thomas sat in the front row, shoulders squared, hands clasped. He looked like a man trying to appear teachable. The facilitator began with statistics. Ironically, my statistics. She spoke about employee retention, burnout, flexibility, the correlation between work hours and gender equity. Every line of data felt like déjà vu. I wondered if she knew whose fingerprints were on her slides. Halfway through, she paused for discussion. "Has anyone here experienced a positive change since implementing core hours?" A few hands went up. One of them was mine. I said, "It's made my mornings human again. I'm less tired, my team's happier, and no one misses 7 a.m. meetings." Thomas turned slightly, the way people do when they want to acknowledge you without committing to it. He smirked just enough for me to see. Then he asked, loudly enough for the room to hear, "So, Laura, Are you happy now? There it was. The face-off, polite, public, sharp-edged but wrapped in civility. I met his eyes. Happier than 7 a.m. The room burst into soft laughter. Not cruel, just true. The facilitator smiled. That's exactly the point, she said, clicking her pen. It wasn't much. Just a sentence. But in an office built on control, humor can be revolution. After the session, people started using the phrase as a joke. Happier than 7 a.m. became a kind of password, a quiet wink across cubicles. Someone even printed stickers. HR approved them. I stuck one to my coffee mug. A week later, I saw Thomas leaving early, 4:10 p.m. He caught my eye in the hallway. For a second, I thought he'd say something, but he just nodded once and kept walking. There's a kind of peace in knowing someone has learned the rule, even if they'll never admit who taught it. I started noticing smaller changes too. Meeting invites came with actual polls. Does this time work for everyone? Became a normal sentence. Managers started blocking focus hours. HR launched a Flex and Fairness campaign. None of it had my name on it. That was fine. My name didn't need to be on the change. It was in the change. By the end of the quarter, productivity had risen 8%. The company newsletter mentioned the core hour success. The same men who once mocked flexible schedules were now boasting about work-life alignment. That's how culture really shifts, when fairness becomes fashionable. One afternoon, I was walking past the break room when I overheard two interns talking. One said, "I love that meetings start later now." The other replied, "Yeah, apparently some senior manager pushed for it years ago." I smiled as I poured my coffee. I didn't correct them. Legends work better when they're faceless. At home, my daughter asked if I could volunteer at her school's morning reading program. "It starts at 8:15, she said apologetically. I laughed. I can make that work. The next morning, I walked into her classroom with a basket of books, still wearing my office badge. She sat next to me as I read aloud to a row of children who smelled like crayons and cereal. For the first time in a long time, time felt like it belonged to me again. Driving to the office afterward, I saw my reflection in the rearview mirror. The same tired eyes. Maybe a few more lines, but they looked steady, awake, present. The kind of face that belongs to someone who's no longer apologizing for existing on her own schedule. I parked, walked to my desk, and looked at the wall. My paper calendar was still there, taped and worn at the corners. I hadn't marked anything on it in weeks. The red X's had stopped after the audit. The rest of the squares were clean, white, open. I took a yellow sticky note, wrote one sentence, and pressed it into the center of the month. This time belongs to my life. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. It's strange how peace can arrive without applause. One day you wake up and the world that used to feel heavy just doesn't anymore. No one sends you flowers for fixing it. They don't have to. You just notice the silence has changed texture. That was how it felt walking into work those next few weeks. The office didn't feel tense, or loud, or forced. It just breathed differently. You could tell the difference in the tone of morning emails, the slower way people poured their coffee, the soft laughter from the break room at 9 instead of 6:50. The building itself seemed to have exhaled. Thomas didn't speak to me much after the training. Not out of resentment, I think, but out of awareness. The unspoken kind. Once, I caught him adjusting a meeting time from 8:30 to 9:15 and quietly nodding to himself. It was an apology. It was adaptation. And that was enough. One Friday, I was leaving early, 4:05 p.m., the same minute I had once used as a finish line in my head, when I noticed a small sign on the bulletin board by the elevators. It was a printed page with the title Core Hour Reflections. Employees had been invited to share what the change meant to them. There were a few notes pinned under it. More time with my kids. Less burnout. Better mornings. One of them, written in blue ink, said, "Feels like someone remembered we're human." I stood there longer than I expected, reading each one twice. Then I wrote my own on a sticky note and placed it at the bottom. It's amazing what happens when time belongs to everyone. When the elevator doors opened, I caught my reflection in the mirror wall. I looked older than when it all started, but not smaller. Just steady. Like someone who finally moved her life back into her own hands. The next Monday, the internal newsletter arrived with a familiar headline. The Core Hour Policy, A Year of Balance. There was a paragraph about retention rates, another about productivity. Near the bottom, one line stood out. Sometimes fairness doesn't announce itself. It just lasts. I smiled when I read that. Someone in corporate communications had a poet's heart. At home that evening, I walked into my small office and looked at the paper calendar one last time. It was almost full, days neatly crossed, no red marks, no patterns of exhaustion. Just one yellow note in the middle of the month, still taped where I'd left it. This time belongs to my life. I thought about taking it down. I didn't. I liked the reminder. Outside, the sky was turning gold. I could hear my kids arguing softly about what movie to watch. My husband called from the kitchen, asking if I wanted tea. The ordinary rhythm of a life that finally fit again. I sat at my desk, turned off my work phone, and for a moment, let the quiet fill the room. Not the stressed kind of quiet. The good kind, the earned kind. It's funny, isn't it? How revenge doesn't always look like payback. Sometimes it looks like balance. Sometimes it looks like a 9 a.m. meeting instead of 7. Sometimes it's as small as a paper calendar, covered in red marks that eventually fade. That was my story, where fairness spoke softly. But it lasted. Subscribe to Office Revenge Files for more stories where women turn silence into power. Because sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one that changes everything.